Alright friends, welcome to another Dominions 5 Nation Guide, and this one comes again courtesy of my friendly and supportive patrons, whose support really does mean the world to me. It is extremely motivating to have people say that they are willing to invest and support in you, analysing a topic that is near and dear to them. And this is the patron who has previously looked at nation analyses and now has us looking at Helheim. Let me just get one thing out of the way before I begin here. I think there can be real joy in Dominions in playing the relatively weak and challenging nations. There are nations out there that are just a little bit gimped. They have serious problems that make it hard to close out a game, that make you feel like you're trying to solve a problem. And there are other nations that make you feel like you're on a power trip, that just fill your quiver with a whole bunch of capabilities that are extraordinarily deadly. And the biggest challenge of the game becomes how to use those in a way that doesn't embarrass you, because everyone knows your nation is good, and how you control the reputation and threat profile of your nation to stop you getting coalitioned or locked down or shot down. I squarely think that Helheim, this is getting to the end of my evaluation, which I'll go into more detail then, but here at the top, I think Helheim is in the second category personally. Any game I am in, I regard Helheim with intense suspicion because of the capabilities they have available to them and the danger that they will run away with the game if left unfettered. The person who sponsored this video made an observation that Helheim tends to start strong, and what they're really after is a guide on how you seal the deal with Helheim. What is it about the nation that lets you transition from obvious early strength to actually dominating the game and winning the game later on? So I'm going to try and keep that in mind when we get to the latter parts of this video. But first, as always, let's start with the lore. Okay, so Helheim is a nation primarily of Vanir, so the Scandinavian Norse elves. They're distinct from Vanheim, though, as a political entity. They have, at this stage, for an age, been sequestered away with similar but different culture, duties, and background. They live in a relatively small territory, and unfortunately for Helheim, eventually they will be subsumed into Vanheim if nothing changes. So Helheim is a small bit of what we would think of as the Scandinavian area, centered around the place where the dead can pass on their way to Hell, the realm of the dead. It's described here as Nippehallen. I knew it as Nippehelir when I was looking into this topic. I'm not sure why in Dominions this is. Maybe they're just different versions of the same word. I don't know. But the point is, there is a place where the dead sort of pass on their way towards the realm of the dead. A different realm of the dead, presumably, to the one that the Fomorian giants guard. Similar sort of mythos. The Vanir of Helheim are different from their colleagues, however, in that they are aligned with the god of death. The hanged kings had originally hung themselves, which is a theme you'll recognize from parts of Norse mythology, in order to learn the secrets of death. Which Norse god does that sound like, for example? And now they basically guide the dead on their way to Hell in the service of a dead god. Helheim's ways change with the coming of the Ascension War, because the role that the dead god, or the god of the dead, so Hela, presumably, plays, although that's not entirely certain. In fact, Hela is a hero character for this, but anyway, a god of the dead is replaced by the awakening god, and they rise in service for them instead. But in the absence of an Ascension War, you have to presume that they continue their practices just as guides of the dead. They're not sailors, they're not raiders, they're not adventurers, unlike their kin in Vanheim. They're more settled, less expansionist, and importantly, they're not involved in the fights against the Urton, against the giants. And as a result, you have to presume they don't take quite so heavy casualties. However, they do eventually get involved in significant issues with their kin over cultural issues and whatnot. But the point is, eventually the two societies will merge, and the Vanir will mostly come together into one nation, although there will be some in the nation of Vanhurst in the Middle Age, meaning that the Van remain ununited as a species. In the early age, culturally, there is a distinction, more than there is physically. And that culture has to do with alignment with a different god, with a different cause. They make different allies in the form of the you can find the Svartalf, so the dark dwarves rather than the lighter dwarves that you see aligned with Vanheim, the nation. And a couple other signs of the distinct religious and cultural practices, mostly around the presence of the Valkyries, who are the chosen and blessed of the dead god. They have female Vanir who have been blessed in ancient times with the secret of flight by the dead god. So, that's what we are. In the lore, we are a relatively small splinter of the Vanir serving the dead god, not involved in the major wars and eventually doomed to disappear. In-game, however, we are a complete and utter powerhouse when we are playing Helheim. So I'm going to go through, as always, the roster and national characteristics up front. We'll then dip into the mod inspector, go over what's available there, and then we'll start bringing this together. What is amazing about this nation, what are its tools that are available, and then because it's been a specific patron request, we'll talk about the weaknesses, why Helheim as a nation sometimes falls down, and how it needs to carry itself, particularly to move into the middle and late game. I'll go through some options there, and we'll close out with pretended design. But before we do that, as always, the units and the majors. And here, the run-through is pretty quick, because you'll notice Helheim has quite a compact roster. And it's even more compact than it seems, because a lot of the unit lineup is just a variety of the same basic troop. And then amongst the mages, the basic characteristics of the mage that you're recruiting doesn't change a huge amount. You're sort of picking your paths and how expensive you want to be on a sliding scale. They're not hugely distinct. Helheim is not a nation of incredibly diverse offerings. It's a nation of powerful offerings. There's a difference. You have exactly one unit or one recruitable thing in your entire roster that costs 10 gold or less, and only one thing that is a human. It's this, the Surf Warrior. The Surf Warrior is basically your militia unit. There are, the idea is the Vanir capture humans, and as a result, they become serfs. I'm not exactly sure how Helheim gets its serfs, considering they're not sailing and raiding the same way that the Vanir or Vanheim are, but they have serfs nonetheless. Unfortunately, the Surf Warrior is let down by a couple of things. The first is that he isn't a slave, despite the fact he is a serf. This means you get all the fun of being 8 morale and generally shit in that respect, like you would expect for, say, a lot of militia units, but you don't pay half upkeep, which would have been really handy. Other than that, he's a relatively average human infantryman in a lot of respects. Low protection, 8 gold, 6 resources, 5 recruitment points. He'll slow down your army because he's got lower map move than everyone else. The reason this unit feasibly exists is because you need mass or you need siege chaff. But as we'll go through, there are other ways to get siege chaff and mass into the armies of Helheim, although perhaps not right at the start of the game. So if you are engaged in a super early war and you need siege chaff, Surf Warrior's got your back, but he's not great otherwise. He's there, but he's not incredible. Then you have a variety of Vanir infantry troops, non-sacred. The Huskar and with the spear and Huskar with an axe. So Huskar with the spear, what are we paying for here? So we're paying 25 gold. We get 12 attack, 16 defense, glamour, stealthy. So because it's a van. 9 protection is okay. 14 magic resistance is great. 11 morale is great. 14 damage on the spear, 13 damage on a precision 12 javelin that only goes 11 squares. So you're going to hit a lot with those javelins. This is most people look at this and go, that's pretty decent. And then there's an axe version that still has the javelin. Just the difference is we trade out our spear, so we trade out a little bit of repellability and that piercing damage. So for 19 slashing damage instead. So we want to hit really hard at something that doesn't have high protection. That's actually a lot of damage against something that doesn't have very high protection at a reasonably good defense value. And remember, you still have glamour, so you've still got a mirror image that is protecting you as well. This defense skill is already good, but you also have this glamour effect. I'll talk about the Hitman as well before I evaluate these guys, but most people look at this roster and they don't really get excited about the infantryman. The Hitman is a bit of an upgrade. So now we're at 17 damage slashing, broadsword, and we've lost our javelin. In exchange, we're now attack 12, defense 17, glamour. We're paying 30 gold, 17 resources, 25 rec points. You'll notice that there's pretty high rec point costs across the board for our van troops. Presumably that represents maybe the numbers of Vanir that are available to Helheim, perhaps. That's one measure of what recruitment points often symbolizes. He's slow, though. 10 map move is slow. Hitman will slow down your armies relative to the other builds you can bring as Helheim. But this is a pretty elite infantryman. The reason I stop here before we underappreciate these units is because you'll remember when we talked about Fomoria, people get really excited about the Numidian warriors. Numidian warriors are a capital-only, non-sacred that you can get for Fomoria, and people talk about whether they're a viable alternative to expansion with Blessed. The answer is they are. How much they add to the nation in terms of stealthy raiding and whatnot, and how they're a really, really good deal, and how even though you can only recruit a stealthy leader in your capital, they're still worth investing in. The Numidian warrior is better than the Vanir troops of Helheim. They're better. They have a magical weapon. The stats are a little bit better, particularly the defensive stats relative to the Axeman here are a lot better, and the attack skill is a couple of points higher. But they are more expensive, and they are capital only, and they are limited in their use because of your limited availability of leaders. So what I'm trying to say here is, sure, Helheim's infantry are not as good as like Fomoria's Numidians. They're certainly not as good as the sacred infantry of like Vanheim with the Vanhursts. But they're pretty good. Like Vanish infantry, if all they're doing is slogging it out on a front line with other people that are trying to stab them, something like a Hirvner here will barely get hit, and when he gets hit, will maybe take it in the mirror image, and if he doesn't take it in the mirror image, can probably tank the protection. And then he's going to be hitting back at 17 damage, attack skill 12. Like, he's going to kill some fools. He will cut some humans up. These are good, stealthy, glamoured infantry. Then you have, we'll do the two sacreds together. You have the mounted Hirdman, and this is maybe one of the reasons why people looking at Helheim maybe don't dwell on the infantry as long as perhaps they should. It's because the mounted Hirdman is very attractive and non-sacred and available everywhere. So the Hirdman mounted will always be competing with the Hirdman on foot. The difference is this one costs 48 recruitment points. What's the trade-off? So this is a non-sacred Elven cavalryman, if you're looking at the archetype of the unit. So you pay 50 gold. For that, you get 19 defense and the mirror image. You get attack skill 12. 11 protection is decent. Obviously, it's on a horse, so halving the harassment penalty. 2 attacks, a light lance, a hoof. It also has a javelin. The javelin's not particularly important. Good MR, good morale. The problem, of course, with a unit like this is if it goes into a slogging match against 5 infantrymen, it might get killed. It might. But it also might kill them all. It also might kill them all. Defense skill 19 is high. It's not in the same category as Sacred Cavalry in terms of being able to fight stand-up fights, but small groups of mounted Hirdmen are perfectly capable of massacring most PD types. Absolutely massacring it. And they're extremely fast-moving, and they're recruitable anywhere. So, you can do worse than having an elf on a horse. Not being sacred, they have a lot of weaknesses that become apparent as the game goes on, because you can't bless them, so you can't give them resistances to all the forms of evocations and battlefield wipes and magic that can wipe out 100 gold per square if you lose a square of mounted Hirdman, or 90 gold per square if you lose a square of non-mounted Hirdman. But if you're using these in the raiding category, going around and stomping provinces, which you can do with units as well as with your thugs, they work perfectly well. So do your infantry. So do your thugs. We'll get there. Helheim can raid, okay? Helheim can raid. Recruitable anywhere. 2 capital-only sacred, so you don't have scalability on your sacred units. But that's probably okay. You got Valkyries and you got Hellherdings. The latter, the mounted cavalry, the pony boys, are probably going to be your go-to. What have we got here? 65 gold. So not that much more expensive than the mounted Hirdman. normally you're paying about maybe, I think it's about a 30% tax for being sacred, which works out in this case to 65 gold. It's about right. You're not paying anything for any of the other elements of the unit, right? You're only paying for the sacredness, which I consider a bargain in the circumstances. 14 hit points. Pretty good. 12 resources is cheap. 48 rec points is not. Map move 24 is exceptional. Protection 11 is, it's okay. 14, 13 here, great. Strength 12, above average, great. 13, 19, good stats, good baseline statistics. 19 defense on a horse is great. You're only going to get harassed a little bit. You're probably going to be pretty hard to hit, and that's before you add the mirror image. 13 means you might repel a couple of things with the length 3 if they've got short weapons, and you're going to be hitting often enough. Combat speed 26 means you zoom across the field. And then you get a couple of freebies. Spirit Sight is the biggest freebie. This means that Helheim's Sacreds list and a lot of their mages are quite good at waging battles in the dark, in caves, under darkness. On those conditions, these units go from being good to unfreaking stoppable in a conventional fight. Because remember, if your opponent is neg 6 on their attack and defense, they've gone from hitting you once in a blue moon to they just won't. They just won't hit you over the course of a normal battle. It also means that this is the early era, so Ubar exists. You save the Spirit Sight Bless points if they happen to be in the game, which most people normally would take if Ubar is around, because not having Spirit Sight against true invisibility opponents is, well, it's oppressive. It's a bad place to be. And then, of course, you're sacred. So you have a 2 attack, high defense, high statistic, high mobility, stealthy glamoured, elf on a horse, and now it's sacred. And that transports this unit from being an early game gimmick to something that can give the entire game through, because you can layer resistances or statistics or whatever on these things. You can make them disgusting. They are every bit as disgusting as white centaurs, and anyone who says otherwise can fight me. This unit loves a bless that will get it through the battlefield wipes and the evocations and the counters that people would normally roll out to deal with elite units. It's already got a decent amount of MR, but if you can slap some elemental resistances on this thing, give it even just a little bit more defense attack, maybe a little more strength to get that lance charge up to something a little more devastating, these things will be lawnmowers. And maybe that's a good spot for me to show you my initial expansion before I talk about the mages, because you've seen me do good expansion before. I'm going to tell you right now, this is my first run. This was my first test expansion run. Same map as all the others. And I didn't go a heavy bless, and heavy bless for my units would stand me in good stead during the expansion phase. Instead, I went for the sort of rainbow bless that's going to stand me in good stead later on, help keep my thugs and things alive against the sort of things that might counter them. So, it's a rainbow bless with good scales. And this is a 48 province expansion, an income of 3,026 gold, fort with lab and temple, palisade up in 1 turn and a person there to lab and temple it, palisade up about to go to a fortress, palisade in construction somewhere else as well. There we are, palisade in construction, 1 month to completion. Palisade was about to commence there. I've gone crazy on the infrastructure. I have more money than God. I dominate the map. Now, this expansion is so good that you wouldn't want to do it in a multiplayer game. And you can't do it in a multiplayer game. You'd be hitting people's borders too soon. I deliberately tried to simulate encapsulating bits of territory so you could later backfill them in. So I've surrounded entire groups of independent provinces that I'm simulating that I could take later. Expansion this good is just going to get you into early wars, and you need to be ready to go into an early war if you're going to go this well. The purpose of this test is always to illustrate how well can a nation expand, and the answer with Helheim is phenomenally. And the reason is that a Vanhurst and 5 Hellherdings with the sort of bless I went with, which is pretty mild in terms of what it is. It's a full rainbow. Can do basically 0 attrition expansion against just about everything, and after you've taken the first 2 provinces around your capital, you can probably put out one of those parties every turn, which means your growth starts out as 1 province per turn, and then it's 2, and then it's 3, and then it's 4, and it just goes. Occasionally you need to bring parties together, or consolidate, or move around, sure. Couple that with the high mobility of troops coming out of your capital means that the troops get to the front line where the expansion front is a lot quicker. You're consistently jumping provinces and getting out into the distance. So, Helheim's troops allow it to expand phenomenally well. There is still one more unit to talk about. It's the other capital-only sacred. This is the Valkyrie. The Valkyrie suffers from a problem. The Valkyrie suffers from the problem that it is competing for capital-only sacred spots with the Hellherding. The Valkyrie is altogether a less impressive, but still quite good unit. If this was the only capital-only recruitable, people probably wouldn't complain. They wouldn't know what they were missing out on. The Valkyrie loses out on not being a cavalryman and therefore not having the hoof attack, but still has good protection, good hit points, good magic resistance, good morale, still has free spirit sight, still has glamour and mirror image, has a medium damage spear attack at attack skill 13, defense skill 17, so great, hard to hit. Its map move 26 is even higher than the Hellherding, and it's a flying unit, which means this unit can do back rank assassinations. It can deal with hostile territory. You're never going to be held back by bad terrain as Helheim in an emergency because you can get fully flying parties. The Valkyries are not normally seen in huge numbers because they compete with the Sacred Cavalry, but you shouldn't forget that you have this in your roster if you're playing Helheim. They have a place, they have a purpose, they can catch your opponent off guard. For example, in this situation, if the geography was a little bit different and I was forced to go through mountain passes, maybe flying units that could deal with terrain better would be a good alternative, maybe. Against certain opponents, having a small squad of 5 or 6 attack rear sacreds is a low investment for what it makes them do with their formations, because if they move a whole bunch of defenders back, then the lawnmowers that are your Hellherdings and your infantry are going to come up front and cream them. So it puts them between a rock and a hard place. All in all, good if compact unit lineup. Solid infantry, 1 available siege chaff militia unit, which is better to have than not have. A recruit everywhere ponyboy cavalryman, an excellent capital-only sacred cavalryman, which I think is probably one of the dominant archetypes of sacred units. If you were to just say what is a theme for some of the really good sacred units that are out there in Dominions, sacred cavalry is one of the types that is generally considered very, very good. And that's because of how, because of defense and harassment and how those work. Sacred Cavalrymen are very, very good. So you think, okay, the unit lineup is good. The mage lineup's going to have to let the nation down, otherwise, balance. Well, Ilwinter doesn't really believe in balance, so let's look at the mage lineup. The Van Scout is not great because he's expensive for what he is. You're going to want independent scouts. The purpose of scouts is to be cheap and be everywhere. So having a Van Scout who is stronger and better is just not a great idea. But hey, you can recruit scouts in your forts if you are desperate. The Vanhurst is the meat and potatoes of your, in most builds, your research core, of your early expansion parties. It's not the cheapest researcher out there, but it's a thing. What is the Vanhurst? The Vanhurst, very similar to the one, I think identical to the one that you see in Valheim. So, 120 gold, 13 resources, 2 recruitment points, very fast, highly elite elf on a horse with glamour and mirror image and all those good traits, is sacred, so only costs the same as a 60 gold mage in terms of upkeep, is just Air 1. That's it, just Air 1. Priest 1 and has 7 RP. 7 RP is not good research output, especially not for 120 gold, but again, he is sacred. This ain't no slave mage. This ain't no efficient researcher that is a highlight. However, perfectly functional. This unit is capable of doing very, very light thugging. Air 1 is good enough to do very, very light thugging, usually with gems. One gem will allow it to mist form, and then you've got mist form. You're naturally mirror imaged. You can do arrow shield, and you've got the benefits of whatever your bless happens to be. So you can do some very light thugging with these guys. Mostly, however, they exist to do research. Air 1 is not going to be a particularly useful combat path unless you're bringing a lot of them to the fight and you have Storm up, which you may. We'll get to that later. The Hellcal is very similar. This is the Hellcaler. I probably butchered that there. I'm good with some and terrible with others, but I try my best. This is a Vanhurst, but now we have Death 1 instead of A1. That's the basic trade-off. We have Spirit Sight, which the normal Van didn't have. The Helheim one, the commanders of the Hellherds have Spirit Sight, and you've got Death 1 rather than Air 1. That's your trade-off. Most of the time, you're probably going to favour Air 1 as a path over D1, but D1 does have a place. So just remember that you have that, but most of the time I see more Vanhursts than I would see Hellcars because the thug potential of the air builds. Now, once you have money, and you should have money, most people tend to move over to Vangraals for combat and keep the Vanhursts and whatnot for research purposes. The Vangraal is 260 gold, so significant increase in price, more than twice as much, and you only get an extra 4 research points, so you don't want to be using these things to search. You also only get 2 extra paths. You get Air 2, Blood 1. The Blood 1 makes this your only ordinary, recruitable, reliable blood hunter, which instantly makes you a blood nation, but not a big blood nation. You can get a blood income as Helheim. You won't run a huge blood economy. Air 2, however, is a huge jump. Unfortunately, the unit pays a premium for being Holy 2 when you really don't want it to be. Yeah. Blood 1 does, however, mean it is capable of being a Sabbath mage, so don't forget that. Blood as well as Astral will get you into a communion if you need to. The Air 2, however, is a big jump in its ability to be a self-supporting thug. So, A2 means that you can mistform yourself without having to have gems. So something like Mistform, Arrow Shield, maybe Personal Flight if you want to jump into the back line. A little bit of kit. These things will slaughter PD. In fact, with no kit, they can handle some PD, but it's usually just better to give them a little bit of kit to help them on their way. Perfectly capable of handling it. In combat, they're also one of your primary combat mages, probably the primary combat mage, because Air 2s with a storm become Air 3, which means instantly you're back in what we talked about for Fomoria. You're in Thunderstrike territory, you're in Air Elemental territory. Air 3 is a magic number, and if you're a nation that can cast Storm, your A2s are basically A3s under the right circumstances, so bang. Vangraals are in the game. This unit is a combat mage, it is a army commander, it is a thug, it does it all. The penalty is 260 gold. Then you got your diversity pick, the Svartalf. So this is a dark dwarf. This is an evil dwarf, because apparently having dark skin and living underground makes you evil. This gives you Earth 2, Death 2 reliably off the bat, recruitable. Just recruitable. Capital only, unfortunately. And then you got a random Earth, Fire, so you can get Fire 1 here, Air, Earth, Death. And of all of these, going up to E3, naturally, that's great. That gets you as high as E4 with boots. Svartalfs mean that you will always be able to get to hammers. If you get an E3, you can get to the hammer. You can get to the hammer sooner. D2 means, and up to D3 really means you can be D4. And the fire access, the little bit of fire access, means this is how you will find your fire gems. And he's the guy who is going to make your lanterns. Helheim is a nation that relies on, in my view, boosters in order to make its research work. You have fantastic magic access. You've got mages who can cast spells. You have the paths you need to be very, very dominant. However, in order to make the most of it, you're going to need research boosters, and that means Vanhurst is making quills, our quills, using hammers that were made by your Svartalfs, and then eventually your Svartalfs can make... would that be Svartalfir? Anyway, I'm not sure what the plural of that is. Would make lightless lens. So, research boosters are important. The Svartalf is one of the ways you get there. Another traditional weakness of elven nations is the absence of like good, bulky, survivable chaff. Good, bulky, survivable chaff goes a long way. Let me just remember where this is. It is construction. I just forgot it's bloody level 1. Okay, so a traditional weakness of elves is the absence of big, bulky HP units, so line holders, evocation catchers, and siege chaff. Well, there's this weird spell at construction, literally construction 1, that has this weird air death crosspath requirement, and is super cheap and super low cost. For 1 air gem, you make a corpse construct, and we'll look a corpse construct, which we will look at in the Mod Inspector later. But it is a high HP, shock-resistant, tanky, siegey, undead unit. And you get 1 for 1 air gem naturally, but you can boost this with items, with storm spools and lightning rods, which are pretty cheap, low-level air magic items. So if you have death air crosspath and you have an affordable air death mage and you have an air income and you got a little bit of construction and the ability to make a storm spool and a lightning rod, so you can see we've narrowed ourselves down in terms of the numbers of nations that we are talking about, you can be very efficient in shitting out high HP siege, undead siege chaff that is resistant to lightning, which is something that you're going to be indiscriminately throwing around the battlefield. Therefore, the dis exists to make corpsemen. This is an A1D1 Priest 1 Sacred Mage, 200 gold. She is female, and because she is a female Van of Helheim, she can also fly. So I lie. She has two purposes. Her first purpose is, yes, to make corpsemen. Her second purpose is to lead the Valkyrie, is to lead the flying parties, so that you can have 28 map move sacred flying units. That is an insane level of mobility if you want to take some units with you. She's also, for good measure, a spirit-sided combat caster, and combat caster can make for some pretty interesting thug options. The lack of A2 hurts, and Death 1 doesn't add a huge amount, you would think, naturally, but Combat Caster can lead to some really fun shenanigans with things like Shockwave in close combat. It can be quite devastating. So the Dis is capable of defending herself. The Disir are valuable to you in that conjuration and also that leadership and off-thugging role. The problem with the Disir is that it is a capital-only mage. So you're probably realistically only going to recruit enough of them to lead 1 or 2 parties of flying units, if that's something you want to do. Remembering, flying units are pretty good at sieging relative to other units. The problem is, in your case, the only flying unit you have is capital only and sacred, so maybe forget about that. But mostly to pump out the corpseman constructs. And then you got the big daddy, the Hungerrot. So this is a senior Hellcal. 410 gold. Air 2, Death 3, Holy 2, so you got no recruitable Holy 3s. Random. 100% Air, Earth, Death, Blood, 10% the same. So you can double up, but never assume you will. However, if you roll the dice enough of time on this slow to recruit, capital only 410 gold mage, your nation does have a way to recruit A3, to recruit D4. The other ones I'm not as excited about. The other ones we can talk about, like thugging options with these, but the gateway options here are A3 and D4. A3 are your Stormcasters, which instantly catapults your A2s from okay to very good battle mages. Just being able to put a storm up instantly helps things. Death 4 is an important number because Death 4 with a stave is actually is Death 5, which is high enough to make the booster, which is high enough to get the Death 6. So you have native access to climbing the Death ladder to everything that isn't Tartarians in terms of summonable units. So you can go into the Immortal game, you can play with the big boys in terms of your Wraith Lords and your Immortals, and you have a high native death income, and you'll be finding lots of death sites with these guys and your Sparth Elves. You're probably searching with the Sparth Elves, because you want to get the fire gems as well. Give them a stick, you're still searching at D3. You're also in the realm where you can talk about things like Darkness. This is your Wailing Winds caster. This is your Wind of Death caster. This is the caster of all the stupid, oppressive, air death, cross-class shit that we talked about when we talked about Fomoria. Air death is a stupendously powerful cross-path, and the Hunger Drot is capable of delivering. It's capable of delivering in a package that is extremely mobile, both conventionally and in teleportation terms. This thing can cloud trapeze, this thing can move conventionally very quickly, and it's stealthy and it's glamoured. So if it's popped up and done something, it can then disappear. A stealthy unit going stealthed is protected from just about everything that isn't Mind Hunt in terms of retaliation on the following turn. And at magic resistance 18, it doesn't take much boosting for that to be a bit of a joke as a threat. You can easily put this thing at MR 22, and at that case, well, the enemy is almost welcome to Mind Hunt them, because they'll be spending so many pearls per kill that it's probably worth it anyway. As thugs, they're obviously very good, they're just massively overpriced for what they are. It's still only got 15 hit points. You can make them pretty damn unkillable. They can misform, they can soul vortex, they can invulnerability, they can do all sorts of things to make themselves really, really hard to kill. The earth randoms, because you won't be using them as battlefield casters as much, can be your Iron Skin. Like, there's some heavy thugging potential in this. I just find the chassis overpriced and the hit points too low for that job. The final random to talk about is the Blood random. Now, the Blood random, for battlefield purposes, might actually be as good as the Air or the Death randoms, because it's a communion mage. Now, you do not have natively crystal pathing on this nation. So unless you put crystal pathing on your god, and I did, it's just my god wakes up at turn 36, so until then I've got nothing. Blood lets you go into Sabbaths, so it is possible for you to Sabbath. This is a very expensive communion, mind you. You can Sabbath with either shamans you find or your own blood Vanhursts in order to boost the paths as high as you feasibly are willing to go with the expenditure. That's niche, but it can have a purpose. If you can get to the point where you're going Blood Rain, and this is probably getting into late game stuff for a moment here, but let's find it. Blood Rain. Blood Rain is Blood 3, so you need 4 slaves to get there. Mind you, this can be done with just a Vanhursts instead, so 5 Vanhursts. Blood Rain, which gives minus morale to everyone on the field, -4, plus Wailing Winds is basically, if it has morale, it's gone. Wailing Winds puts a timer on the battlefield. Blood Rain removes the timer. It sets that clock to 5 minutes to midnight, and everything just books it. The sky is raining blood, the wind sounds like death, people are out of there. So, there is a usefulness in just that humble Blood 1 path. So that was a pretty extensive overview for a relatively small number of units. I'm going to talk about the national characteristics here, then we're going to go to the Modern Spectre. This is not a nation with a huge number of nationals, but we're going to go over them anyway. But firstly, characteristics. You prefer Cold 1, which means this is a Cold 3 nation. Your forts are standard, so they're not awful. You're not palisade locked, but you don't get advanced forts or anything like that. And finally, you can perform Blood Sack. Blood Sack is I can't demonstrate it because I don't have any blood slaves at the moment. But if you do, what this means is in a temple, a priest can sacrifice a certain number of slaves. It's just one in the case of your mages, and that triggers extra temple checks, quite a lot of extra temple checks, which means you can aggressively push Dominion using mage turns and blood slaves. This means you are rewarded. One, it means you can dom push better than other nations. The second thing is you are rewarded for having good scales more because you are more capable of aggressively pushing those scales. You're not limited to just putting holies in temples and preaching and then hoping the candles bleed out. You can aggressively cause those temple checks. So it's something that few nations have that you should remember you have. All that said, we'll go to the mod inspector before we start talking tactics. Okay, summoned units first. I first wanted to show off the corpse construct because this isn't a national unit, but we talked about its importance. So, corpse construct, 25 hit points, 0 prot, magic resistance 4. So that's awful in some respects. You are very vulnerable to banishment, but unless it's an instant kill banishment, you've still got to chunk through 25 hit points at size 3, which means you're only fitting 2 in a square. They resist shock, they resist cold, they resist poison. They're not here to punch people. But that is a lot of HP and a lot of strength on a unit that doesn't eat, is mindless, and will never run away. Not bad. Not bad when you can get a whole bunch of these for every single air gem and make up your armies of highly shock resistant stuff. You can gum up the battlefield with corpse constructs, which means that when you drop Wrathful Skies on your otherwise mega shock resistant army, everyone cries. So, hooray. Corpse constructs, significant. The other significant pickups would be in the blood field. You can technically get into like the Storm Demon game, but that's not really chaffing it up. That's just bringing in a super elite summonable unit if you go into blood. Let's talk of the actual national summons here. There are 3 non-battlefields and 1 battlefield. Let's just be really quick here. You've got the generic Great Bear summoning spell. This is not the superior Slavic holy bears. This is not Rus. This is the undisciplined, shitty, normal bear. You get them for the same reason you normally would. It's because you're only at Conjuration 3 and you want a whole bunch of chaff. However, where on earth have you got Nature 2 in your nation to find the gems and get these guys? You don't have the nature available, and if you find independent nature mages, you're going to be using every nature gem you can find to make vine shields or the things that are required to make vine shields or lion pelts or rings of regen. The stuff you need to keep your thugs. Do not, please God, spend it on bears. That's my opinion. Urton Wolves are a considerably better use of nature gems. They come at Conjuration 4. And for 10 nature gems, you get 5 Urton Wolves. Urton Wolves have 30 hit points, a size 4, have okay stats. They have Berserk, which protects them a little bit. They have Fear Auras and are sacred. Now, having something that is sacred, because your Bless is probably going to be a survivability one that keeps these things alive, is great for Urton Wolves. They will then survive and use their fear auras to rout people. But again, the problem I get to is where are the nature gems coming from, and do they really need to be spent on wolves rather than on more kit for thugs? Am I going to get more use out of 5 of these sacred wolves, or am I going to get more use out of a vine shield? And a lot of the time the answer is the vine shield's going to have lower attrition and let me do a lot more. So it's there. The Draug is a no for me. It's just a no for me. What is this thing? Okay, so it's a 30 hit point undead unit with a fear aura that resists cold and poison. Has a cold aura too. They cost 4 death gems each for a unit. They shape change to a size 3 when they drop below 20 HP, which makes them a little bit stronger and occupy less space. It's not that important. It's just they get bigger when they're hurt, and when they heal up after battle, they shrink again. No. I just think no. My death gems are too valuable. I can do too much with them to spend them 4 gems apiece on a unit. Helheim doesn't lack for units. If it wants chaff and just junk, it can get corpse constructs or it can get serfs. If it wants elite stuff, it's got very good gold purchasable units everywhere. Let me ask you the question. If someone said that they would trade you 4 death gems for 50 gold, is there ever a time you wouldn't buy the death gems? Well, okay. How does a mounted Hitman compare to a Draug? Well, there are ways in which each are better. The Cold Aura and the Fear definitely give the Draug a solid advantage, but if what you're doing is going off and raiding, the mounted Hitman is probably better, more mobile. Could mixing a very few Draug in help? Maybe. I just think it requires a level of consideration and nuance to make efficient that I wonder if it's just going to be taxing your consideration and your planning and just be vulnerable to going wrong. So I'm going to say I don't like the Draug. If I want chaff, I'm going to go elsewhere. If I want elite units, I'm going to go to my national roster. And then we've got a national alternative to summon Air Elemental. The Summon Valkyrie spell, Conjuration 6, so it's 1 level above Conjure Air Elemental. It's only really castable by your big mages, your big air death cross paths. The Disir are probably not going to be A3, they're only going to be A2, which means they need 2 gems in order to cast this rather than the 1. Oh, actually, no, the 2 that they would need to cast Air Elemental, but you can use your O2s to do that. Summon Valkyries if you can cast it. For 1 air gem, so the same as 1 Air Elemental, gives you 7 temporary Valkyries, and they're clones of the Valkyries you can recruit normally. So you get 7 sacred units. So what you would do with this is you would summon, say, you'd cast this 3 times with your 3 big mages maybe, get 21 extra sacreds, you'd script Divine Blessing to go off after these units have been summoned, and they'd all drop in the rear and you'd have 21 disposable sacreds for the price of 3 gems. The question you will always ask yourself with those guys is, can those mages be doing anything better? The answer is going to be like yes most of the time, but sometimes no. And then secondly, if they need to summon something using air gems, is this better than an air elemental? And the answer is going to be yes a whole freaking load of the time. If you're going to do it though, it's important to make sure that Storm only goes up after these guys would have hit the opponent's lines. Otherwise, they're going to walk. They're not Storm Flyers. I wish they were Storm Flyers. I feel like there should be Storm Flyers, but they're not. And if you're going to be putting Storm up early because you've got, say, a big Thunderstrike body with you of a whole bunch of Vanir with Air 2, then you're going to make Air Elementals instead, because Air Elementals in Storm are, as they say, the shit. So there you go. Remember you've got it, but if you only go to Conjuration 5, you don't have it. You need your elite mages to cast it. There are limits that stop it being oppressive. Let us talk about heroes. There is one normally. Sigdriva is a female Hungerdrot. So Hungerdrotning, if I'm saying that at all correctly. What does she give you? Well, she gives you A3, D4. So she's a Hungerdrot, but it's hit both of its randoms. Impossibly. It's hit the air random and the death random. So you're at air 3, you're at death 4, which means you've got a guaranteed path to D5, D6 taken care of. Because she's female, she can fly, so she's even more mobile than her male colleagues. She's a nice extra. She saves you rolling the dice on your the randoms in your sacred capital only recruit, but she herself is a hero, which means you're rolling the dice on her arriving. So she's just an alternative way to hit that mark. Now, if you're playing worthy heroes, and most games I think play worthy heroes, which is the only reason why I review it. I don't normally review mod stuff. There are 3 extras, one of which is Loki. Awesome show, by the way. Hel, the Queen of the Underland, and the Daughter of the Storm. These are all great in their own way. Let's talk about the Daughter of the Storm first. You look and you're like, oh, this is just a super Valkyrie. So she's a super Valkyrie. She's got a built-in lightning spear. She's got some nice lightweight scale mail, so she's got very high defense score. But she's got no magic, and you're like, oh man, all she's got is resist shock. So you're like, oh, it's one of those like, sacred leader, unimportant heroes. No. Right here. Casts each battle storm. She has no turn arrival limit. So if you roll her early, you can be dropping Storm before you've researched Storm. Heck, if you're fighting a very early war, you might decide you don't even need to research Storm. If you've gone the air element route, you're in Conj, or you've gone somewhere else, you don't need to divert into Evo to pick up Storm in an emergency, because she is a staff of storms. She summons Storm every battle. And that means you can be just click and you're on. This means you can save having a big mage cast it and fatigue out. It means that everyone else can be Storm Power and then straight into Thunderstrike. It means in an emergency, that Storm is going to be blocking, not an emergency, just in general, that Storm is going to be blocking the first round of enemy arrow projectiles, which are normally a problem for Helheim. You've got Storm blocking most of those straight out. She's just a good army booster. Keep her alive if you get her. Then you have Hela, and you have Loki. Hela is, well, she's useful. She's great diversity, and she pops up again as in LA Vertiheim. I think a different version of her picks up for another nation as well. I'm trying to think what that is. I swear I've seen her elsewhere. A2, E2, Death 3, Blood 2. Good wide pathing, which means I think she's probably on site searching and forging duty most of the time, to be honest. She's stealthy, she's glamored, she can cast Horde of Skeleton. You're not lacking for other ways to get to D3, you're not lacking for A3, you're not lacking for E2. Getting her high enough to be creating a staff of Elemental Mastery is a little bit laborious. A2, E2 is not quite high enough for you to get there simply. She's got a nice little defense mechanism that she casts Horde of Skeleton on auto cast at the start of the battle. Just one cast, but you still get a free retinue of skeletons. I'm probably site searching with her, to be honest. She's a good battlefield caster. Like, she's useful. You can deploy her, and twice spawning is obviously a good idea, so you don't lose her. But I'm mostly in this for the site searching. And then there's Loki. Loki is, well, Loki's good because he's got F3, A3, so decent paths. Blood 3 is your highest native blood, so Blood 3 is enough to be Blood 4, and suddenly we're in the business of we can do a lot of blood summoning with Fire 3, Air 3, Blood 3, and then boosters being available. This is a nation that's probably going to be able to furnish you a booster for at least some of those. There's some good boostability in Helheim. Plus, he's a mage spy. I think the mage spy thing is a bit of a trap. So the idea is Loki is super stealthy and he sneaks onto an opponent's capital, ha ha ha, and because he's a spy and he's a mage, he gets you all their score graphs. But he's only stealth 65. The enemy will discover he is there straight away because he causes unrest. He will get patrolled and he might die. He needs to be discovered by something substantial to kill him, because he's got good paths and he can cast air elementals and fire elementals and things like that, so he might survive. But I think he's better off being kept safe and used for the some of the specialized ritual summoning that you might need to do, or some of the specialized forging you might need to do. Being your highest blood mage is significant, and I wouldn't get him killed. This is a good hero lineup. It's not an incredible hero lineup. I play Helheim everywhere from like Misfortune 1 to Luck 1 is basically where I go. The heroes don't make or break your nation, but you'll be going to be very happy if you do land them. You're going to appreciate having the high fire access. F3 is good. F3 means you might get to fire boosters because you can probably get the death fire cross path one and then make the flaming helmet, so you can get as high as F5, which is as high as you ever need to go, because at that point you're at Kings of Fire and you're done. So solid lineup, but not super game changing. Okay, we're back after probably a short period of time for you, as in seconds, but quite a while for me as I'm picking up this video again, because I now want to talk about tactics. I'm going to talk about a couple of stages of Helheim's game. I'm going to talk about the expansion phase. We're going to go early game / first war, mid game / second war, and then late game, third war, and later. First of all, let's talk about expansion. And different nations need different, sort of varieties on guidance on how well you expand as a nation. So let me provide a really comprehensive, in-depth piece of advice on how you expand as Helheim. You take 5 to 6 Hell Herdings, you lead them with a mage, you bless them, and then you kill everything without losing anything. There you go. Fantastic. All right. So that's expansion covered. But wait, there is more. One thing that people don't often mention when they describe the strength of a nation, it's actually kind of important because it affects your early game expansion, is the quality of the starting army. Some nations have absolute dogshit starting armies. Helheim's is okay. It's a mixture of serf warriors, who are pretty crap, but you also get a decent number of Huskars, who are quite talented, elvish, glamoured warriors, which means your starting army is also capable of expanding pretty well without any sacreds to back it up. So, expansion parties of maybe 5, I prefer 6 if you can manage it, whatever you can produce in one turn to get a Vanhurst and then a party of at least 5, preferably 6 Sacred Cavalry. That way they can take 1 loss and still not be under the limit. Go out there and expand. With the huge map move that you have, you'll find, and if you can, chart your expansion paths, noting the mobility of the units that you're going to have. So normally, if you want to have super efficient expansion, you'd need to send one army stretching out in a giant, like a noodle, and then the next army in another noodle, because you want to leave as many provinces around your capital as possible because they're close. You can get efficiency for moves for later expansion parties. With Helheim, you don't have to do this as much. You can clear your cap circle sooner because new troops from the capital, particularly if there happen to be roads or plains or things like that around, can travel over them super quickly. And in the event that you have a patch of difficult terrain, remember, under certain circumstances, your alternative is to put together a party of Valkyries led by a Dis, if you need someone who can fly instead, in order to take particularly problematic terrain types. This means that Helheim hits the sweet spot of rapid expansion. There are 3 elements to a sweet spot for rapid expansion in my mind. Firstly, can you produce an expansion party every turn? Yes. Secondly, low attrition in expansion parties, because if your expansion parties don't burn out, they take more provinces by the time your expansion ends. If you can produce an expansion party every turn, let's just say you spam gladiators as Pythium or Ermor or something. Great, you can produce an expansion party every turn, but that entire party disappears after that battle. Or it's a really high attrition sort of force, and it disappears quite quickly. It burns out, and there are no reinforcements far away from your capital. No such problem with Helheim. Low attrition, as long as you pick your targets. Be afraid of massed archery, and that's about it. And even then, it has to be dangerous sorts of archers. And if you have any sort of bless to counter those archers, you don't even need to worry about them. So there are a few things Hell Herdings need to worry about. Archers aren't really one of them. And to be honest, barbarians aren't really one of them, as long as you fight the barbarians right and bring the right number of numbers. Barbarians hit really hard, sure, but they get killed very quickly by Hell Herdings. And if they can't hit them, well, all the damage in the world doesn't mean much now, does it? So that's factor 2. And factor 3 is mobility. How far from your capital / a province can the expansion parties move per turn? Because you might be Agartha, middle-aged Agartha, and you can produce Shard Guard, who are absolutely capable of expanding with 1 turn's production, but they're going to crawl to the front, which means units that you produce on turn 7 aren't going to give you any expansion return until maybe turn 10, turn 11. Hell Herdings and their Vanhurst leaders will be out on the front contributing immediately, which is why you get these stupid, if there are no other players on the map, 48, 50 province expansions. You can probably even do more. Like I said, this was run number 1 without too much effort put in. So expansion takes care of itself. Really, it's up to you to moderate yourself, pick your right borders, decide which neighbors you're going to antagonize by expanding near quickly, which neighbors you're not, which territories you're going to encompass. The expansion phase is your oyster for almost any Helheim build. Let's talk about early game. The early game, so your first war, your late year 0/year 1 war, is going to be won before significant technology has been brought online. That's the nature of year 0. Year 0, year 1 wars are the realm of either rush strats, like Bless rush strats, or Scales rush using national units, or someone has gone hell for leather for a particular breakpoint technology. Helheim is not going to hit a major breakpoint technology in time for a year 0, year 1 war, a very early game war. The reason is, all of their early mage production, because you can produce one expansion party of troops per turn, your capital's mage recruitment is going to be used producing a leader for those units every turn to maximize your expansion. Plus, when you do produce your mages, one, they're either not very good at researching, or two, your units are so expensive that at least until the end of year 0, you're probably not going to build up much of a research core. It's year 1 where you're going to start to research properly. So your first war is going to be fought basically using your sacreds, and then whatever siege chaff you can hack together in order to break someone's capital. The war should be fought according to like elf logic. Elf as many of their provinces as you can in the opening, sure, but focus on eliminating the enemy's conventional army using your ball of blessed elves early, preferably by surprise. Remember, strategically, elven units, the glamoured units, do not appear on the strategic map for your opponents, so they should not know, even if you are not sneaking, that you are concentrating forces on their border. Move hard, move fast, pick someone probably who is going to be a threat later in the game, but won't be able to stop you early. They'll be salty about it, and obviously this comes down to like take account of the diplomatic situation in your game and all of that. Diplomacy is extremely important. However, in the broadest strategic sense, you fight your first war as Helheim early, and you eliminate someone while there isn't really a tool out there that can counter your blessed sacreds. Seizing their infrastructure helps, seizing their land helps. You need to ride the advantage that you have from your blessed pony boys as far as you possibly can early, unless you think it's going to make you a coalition target. The war strategy for elves, just as a matter of refresh, is that usually you want to be on the attack, don't want to be on the defense. You want to achieve surprise, so you want to concentrate your units while they're glamoured / while they're stealthed or concealed. So only bring your siege chaff up at the last possible moment. You want to have infiltrated small parties of Hellherdings and Vanhursts. So all these little leftover expansion parties. For a lot of nations, expansion parties aren't particularly useful past the expansion phase because they tend to have odd compositions and be small and have too many leaders relative to the number of troops, etc. There are nations for whom that's true. Helheim, every surviving expansion party is now a raiding party. It is a party which will stealth into enemy territory, and on turn 1 of the war, it will appear, it will slaughter the PD, and lo and behold, that province is your province. You've just expanded again. And then you'll have a field army, which is a ball of the Sacred Cav, and you'll run over an opposing army. Maybe you're using infantry if the opponent is using troops that call for it. So, it's a massive surprise alpha strike on turn 1 that takes as much of the opponent's territory as possible, followed by, if they're relatively evenly matched with you, a back and forth raiding war that you will inevitably win because you've begun the war by seizing all of the opponent's territory, or a lot of it. Preferably then a decisive victory against the enemy army in the field because you don't particularly like sieges. And then at last you roll up your siege chaff, break the enemy capital, and send a nice heavy ball of sacred cavalry right through their gate in order to eliminate whatever is at the back, set to attack rear. That's the super difficult strategy for an early game war with Helheim. That logic, all the same logic also applies to middle-aged Vanheim, who have sacred cavalry and Vanhursts, or to Pangea with their white centaurs and their ability to have stealthy blessed leaders on them too. It's a basic strategy of the stealthy sacred cavalry elfish nations. Then things get interesting because research starts activating and we start talking about mid-game conflict. And this, I think, is where the patron question was really going to. Mid and particularly late game conflicts with Helheim. Because in their view, the early game really writes itself. And I think that's an opinion I can get behind. The early game for Middle-aged Vanheim, heck for EA Vanheim, but for different reasons, for EA Pangea, for MA Pangea, for EA Helheim, the early game writes itself. The first war writes itself. Once magic starts coming in, you start facing choices. The thing to remember is that you have two real things going for you that you can choose to leverage in your first research-relevant war. The first is that you are a thug nation, a light thugging nation. The second is that you are an air-death cross-path nation. Particularly focus on the air, but the air-death cross-path in particular. So, a couple of paths you can choose on this. Emphasizing the thugging doesn't require large research early on. Picking up just enough alt and the like to mistform yourself, for example, can go a long, long way towards activating Vanjarls and Vanhursts as serviceable thugs, once they can mistform themselves, either with or without a gem, depending on which one you're using. I think you're probably going to have so much money that you can use Vanjarls. Construction up to 2 helps solve your initial research problem to an extent, because you can now make Alquills using the pile of air gems that you will be making, and also gets you the very earliest thug kit, better thug kit obviously at construction 4. Going to construction 2 also nets you construction 1, which gets you corpse construct, and then eventually you want to get the items that allow you to boost corpse construct construction before you really start rolling them out. So there's a lot for you in construction. Construction both gives you your siege chaff / evocation catches, the corpse construct, as well as the storm spool and the lightning rod that you need to make that spell efficient. Plus it gives you the thug gear necessary to activate thugs. And what the thugs allow you to do is raid even more efficiently than you were with your parties of Hellherdings and their leaders. Now you can just use the leader. It's even cheaper and faster to produce, and allows you to now produce raiding parties out of any fort. Also allows you to produce counter thugs to deal with opponents who may be using particular units. So thugs are fantastic. They're great. They're one fantastic opportunity, and construction, a little bit alteration and the like, give that to you. The question then is, what do you do for battlefield magic in the mid-game? How do you win an early game war? And again, you've got a couple of options as air death. See my notes on Fomoria as to why this is so brutally powerful. Conjuration is obviously an option for air elementals, and then eventually for some diversity casts, but you cannot rule out the possibility of going evocation. Evocation to get Storm, evocation to get Thunderstrike, evocation to then get Wind of Death and Wailing Winds, which are almost depressingly battle-winning and determinative in their nature. Wailing Winds is a meta-shaping spell, and the reason you don't see more of it deciding wars in Dominions is, well, there's two reasons. The first is very few nations have access to it and the ability to cast it. You're one of them. You have a mage who is designed to be able to do it. Here it is. This is the Hungerdrot. And the Hungdrotir love nothing more than to cast Wind of Death or Wailing Winds or Wind of Death at people. Wailing Winds being the decisive one. Sorry if I misspoke. The other reason is Wailing Winds wins you battles, but it doesn't kill the opposing units. It only makes them run. But when you're Helheim, it's far easier to turn running enemies into dead enemies, both because you have the ability to raid provinces behind an army and cut retreat links. You can do that with stealthy forces, or you can do that with all your cloud trapezing thugs. Heck, you can, in certain circumstances, if you gear out a Hungerdrot really properly and the enemy army is not ready for him, you can airdrop Vanjarls in every province around an enemy army to raid the PD, and airdrop a Hungerdrot on that enemy army that will survive long enough to rout the enemy forces, and every enemy unit that runs from that field is going to die because their retreats are cut. Even if you can't cut the retreat path, having Sacred Cavalry with high movement speed tends to turn running enemies into dead enemies as they are lanced as they race off the field. So there is that. So evocation is a very strong path. You should also not forget that you do actually have a whole bunch of earth magic sitting here. with your Svartalfs. And the ability to go for big buffing magic. So things like Fog Warriors and Mass Flight are available to you. And as well as having really high paths, you do have some mages who are able to Sabbath in order to get exceedingly high paths. So, how do I summarize all of this? Pick up a few like low-hanging fruit to enable you to thug. Pick up a little bit of alt, pick up a little bit of construction at the very least, decide how much construction you can afford to go for, and then pick a mid-game battle-winning spell combo based on the opponents that you face. Am I going to be Storm Thunderstriking and then going into Wind of Death, Wailing Winds? Do I want to go Air Elementals instead in Conjuration? Are there things there that I want? Pick a path and take it. Keep in mind what you're probably going to be facing and build a force that will counter that, and that answers your mid-game war question. Once you start getting into the mid-game war, however, you're going to face opponents that have more forts, more fortifications, and the siege strength problem, and also enemy evocations and magic are going to become more and more of a threat. And this is where raiding remains super important, because raiding is annoyingly difficult to counter unless they are a Mind Hunt nation, and even then there are ways around it. But you're probably going to need to start bringing more slow-moving conventional forces to back up your fast-moving elves. This means corpse constructs, this means summoned undead, this means conjured chaff, this can mean serfs, this can mean blood magic as well, possibly. Things that give you the siege strength necessary to break down enemy walls and not get bogged down. That said, keeping an enemy bundled up in his fortress, he's never going to win a war like that. So just because you can't seize the fort, you're losing time, yes, but you're going to outgrow them if their entire economy is shut down. I don't think the mid-game is where people who I have seen playing Helheim have had problems. The mid-game seems to right itself. The combination of thugs, raiders, battlefield, evocation, some buffs, a little bit of conjuration, it works really, really well. And there are very few opponents against which the Wailing Wind or Wind of Death don't provide awesome counters. This nation will make Ulm cry with its Wind of Death. Anyone with low MR, zap. And the fact that you can twice spawn your pony mages for 10 death gems, the expensive ones, makes suicide Wind of Death drops against death balls completely viable. Well, what about transitioning beyond the mid-game? What about going into that later game? How do you avoid the problem of being overrun? And here, I'm going to say research, research, research. So important. And you're not naturally predisposed to be very good at research. You're probably not going to have super high magic scales. You may even have drain scales in some builds, although I don't like those personally. So you're going to need to have a bigger economy than everyone else so you can support more research mages and a lot of infrastructure, and 2, you're going to need boosters. You should be quilling with hammers early, and if you get to construction 6, having some Svartalfs producing lightless lanterns is a good idea. You are not naturally going to keep up with the research powerhouses of the age. An equally sized relay will run rings around you. An equally sized Arco will laugh at you. So you're going to need to boost and be really deliberate in order to stay in the research game, especially because there's a lot of research that you can leverage. You can leverage alteration. You need a little bit of magic in other fields so you can cloud trapeze. You want a whole bunch of buffs because you have earth access and whatnot. You might even want to dive into a little bit of blood eventually, although I'm probably using in my blood for construction instead. So the first thing is don't let your research fall off. Then think about your paths. Death magic is considered a super late game path for a reason. Being a high death nation means that the immortal game, there's 2 real ways into the immortal game: death magic and blood magic. You've got both. So you can break into the Liches, the Wraith Lords. You can bring the pain. You can break out darkness if you have gone down that path, for example. you can bring in the Wraith Lords and Liches to do that sort of thing. Life After Death is a fantastic buff for fragile but really good units, which is exactly what you have. So you can get in on the Immortal game, you've got great death income, you should be site searching for death aggressively, and you can turn that into Immortals and Battlefield Magic in really quite an oppressive way. So the longer the game goes, the more you can multiply the number of Immortals you're rolling out and trolling your opponent with, or the number of high-level Death Casters who are dropping all sorts of evil buffs on your units. I don't think you need to plan to go Tartarians. I just don't. Tarts are cool, but I don't think Helheim needs to plan to go Tartarians. I think numbers of Immortals is usually going to have more utility and not cost you as much in terms of God build, because you don't need someone with super high level death to get you there. That said, I understand if you choose to want to go that way. It's just not where I'd take it personally. As for Blood, Blood is fascinating in terms of just the little bit of added capacity it gives you. But let's differentiate here. You have a little bit of Blood in a ritual sense, in the sense that you have level 1. You've got level 1 Blood. Maybe if all the stars combined, you might get B2. But realistically, you are a B1 nation outside of your heroes. And the heroes can produce some good stuff, but on your main stuff, it's Blood 1. And the Vangraal is a very expensive Blood Searcher, so your Blood income is not going to be fantastic. But you've got some. So let's talk about it from the ritual side, and then the more useful, I would argue, the battlefield side. Later in the game, diverting some Vangraals with Sanguine Dowsing Rods to go hunt up some Blood Slaves. They're so expensive, might even be worth giving them the Blood Thorns as well to get them up to Blood 3 equivalent for hunting, can make sense. Getting a moderate blood income can make perfect sense. And you can use that for battlefield casting and for just a few precise forge creations. So, flesh eaters and things like that. There are useful blood items that you can create that you always wish you have. Plus, you can use those blood slaves on the battlefield. And on the battlefield, you shouldn't really feel like you only have Blood 1. You can Sabbath. So it's going to cause a lot of fatigue, but if you're desperate, you can get your blood magic up a little bit higher. And that's where you start talking about some really brutal late game combinations if you've sort of exhausted the research tree and you can afford to go up to B7. B7 gives you Blood Rain, and it also gives you where is it? Curse of Blood. So it's also your Vampire Lord access. Blood Rain on the battlefield plus Wailing Winds equals an instant win. I've talked about that before, and that can be done with Sabbathing. Curse of Blood is harder to get to. You're gonna need, but it's harder to get to, but not that hard to get to. The Death 4 is trivial. Give them a stick, and your Hangdortir are now Death 4. Getting them a Blood Thorn to get them to B2 is really simple. And then after that, well, Blood Slaves are cheap. I just empowered a B3, to be perfectly honest. Heck, you can go Vampires. You can't go efficient Vampires, but you can break a couple of Vampires out. This is another example of a late game option. If you get to the stage of the game where you're like, I need to slow down, I'm going to need a turtle, maybe the diplomacy of the situation or the reality of what enemy armies are out there means that it's not advantageous for you to go pedal to the metal, full steam ahead at an opponent. Maybe you've got some time and the game's going to go long. Well, Vampires will get you into more Vampires, and then you'll Blood Balloon. And you'll do that on a nation which also has all of the natural assets that Helheim has. So, you solve your research weakness with boosters. You use Death Magic to get yourself Immortals. Use Blood Magic to get yourself items, a little bit of battlefield casting, and if you need, less efficiently and more circuitously, more Immortals. You use Construction Magic and Conjuration to solve your Siege Chaff problem. And all of a sudden, I don't see any weaknesses anymore. The vulnerability of Helheim, of the vulnerability of nations in general in the late game to large ritual evocations destroying entire armies doesn't really apply as much to Helheim. They're really suited for the apocalyptic battlefield because small elite armies moving under stealth are basically invulnerable to most evocations, most remote evocations. If you can defend the commanders against Mind Hunt, then you're fine. If you're worried about your opponents dropping counter thugs on you, then stealthing at the end of every move cycle dodges those attacks too. You can survive a lot of what makes the late game and very late game Dominions battlefield treacherous, and you can dish as much of that back as you want because of your thugs, because of your summons. You can deal that right back. Another thing I would say is I didn't talk about the dwarves. Sorry, because I meant to talk about causing the apocalypse deliberately at the end, because of course, what good nation shouldn't consider ending the world as a game tactic? Let's talk about the dwarves. I'm pretty sure I missed them. Okay, so here's the spell. Summon Dwarf of the Four Directions. So this is an expensive late game conjuration spell, and you get some unique for this spell. You get, what is it? Earth 3, Air 4. So getting to it is a little bit pesky, but it's late game, and if you've gone for a rainbow build god, which you probably have, there are lots of builds, but I like rainbows, you've probably got access to this spell. There are 4 of these dwarves, and they give you access to all sorts of cool paths, but the important thing is, after the first dwarf is summoned, because they apparently hold up the sky in the mythos, the first dwarf onwards causes more and more random event hurricanes. I don't care about random event hurricanes, they affect everyone, people won't like you, but there it is. If all 4 are summoned, the world is hit by permanent darkness and perpetual storm. And that sounds amazing for Helheim. You are a nation that in the late game, and you're only going to be able to do this in the late game, because it's like Conj 8, and you need to have like 248 air gems in order to have done this. So this is a huge investment. You will be at the stage of the game where you are using sacred units that can see in the dark, immortals that can see in the dark, battlefield mages that love a good perpetual storm. You might have some side action into a blood economy that can bypass the damage to the economy that the hurricanes and perpetual storm are doing. Sure, there are other nations that will that might benefit from this more than you, but if you look at the status of your game and you decide, actually, permanent darkness and perpetual storm absolutely work for me, both on the battlefield and on the strategic map in this situation, then I'd almost summon the 4 dwarfs just for that reason. And the reason it's particularly cancerous is because this is not a global spell. It's just a summon. So if you want to be a real dick, you can put Shademail Horbigens on those 4 dwarves and put them somewhere in stealth mode. Don't even need to use them in combat. It's a huge waste, but if you don't use them in combat, that makes it an undispellable permanent darkness perpetual storm. There's no counter. There's no counter. There's no way to stop it. You just got to kill the dwarves. Other than that, your opponent is fighting in conditions that massively favor Helheim. Any opponent that doesn't have Spirit Sight will lose any conventional skirmish. And conventional skirmishes remain important even in the late game. You can get away with using less magic escorting and support because you have such a combat advantage. You can get away economically because you have an alternative to gold. You can get away on the battlefield with relying even more on the masses and masses and masses and masses of A2s that you have because they're actually A3s, and air elementals retain brutal efficacy right through the game. Because there's never much counter for someone dropping a size 6 trampler on your head at the end of the first round. So, special mention to the dwarves. Yes, for the magic diversity they bring, although it's diversity that comes really, really late in the game, by which point your god is probably awake and giving you that diversity anyway. but also for giving you a fun way to end the game and make everyone else's life miserable. This is a declare war on the world spell if you've cast it the 4th time, but if you're getting ready to make the end game play to end all end game plays and actually take the title, or if everyone's against you anyway and your back is up against the wall, do it, or heck, threaten to do it and break up the coalition. This is a fantastic nuclear weapon that you can point at the rest of the world. It's just horrifically expensive and it comes very, very late. So, that's sort of your strategic pathway. You expand using sacreds, you win your first war using like mobile sacreds. You transition into mid-game wars where you brought thugging online and probably at least one battlefield spell. You then pick up other battlefield tricks to diversify, so perhaps you add conjuration and buffs to your evocation, for example, while also giving your thugs the ability to say, now they can cloud trapeze and they have construction 6 gear. You go into the late game, where you solve your research problem with boosters, you scale out your economy, and you start winning wars with a force that is still got the core of Helheim in it, but is now bolstered by generic death, generic blood, conjurations, high-level spells of that sort. And if you get really desperate in the late game, you bring down the literal sky on the world, cloak everything in darkness, and ruin the place so that you can rule over the ashes. That is Helheim. I'm going to close out with a couple of comments on God design. I don't want to crush people's creativity here. We're just going to talk about God design in pretty general terms because there's a lot of ways you can go with it. Okay, so let's talk about Helheim. There's two sort of philosophies, I think, two competing philosophies on what you're doing with this bless. They're not completely competing, but they're a sort of intention. The first is the idea of making your Hell Herdings and to an extent your commanders ludicrous early on so you can run the heck over people. So in this case, for example, against someone who doesn't have magic weapons, adding, say, either Stygian Flesh for invulnerability 10, or I think more reasonably, / more popularly, adding Bar Skin and then Fire and Shock Resistance instantly makes the Hell Herding much more difficult to kill because that 11 protection becomes 16 protection, and that relegates a whole bunch of the rare things that do hit through to chip damage. This instantly makes the Hell Herdings really, really dangerous. This would normally be this sort of philosophy of taking incarnate blesses in general, would generally be to take them dormant, expand without them, and then use them to win the first war. This Bar Skin, or adding a whole bunch of like defense skill, or what's another one? A good one. This is a typical unit bless, a true unit bless that is good for your Hell Herdings would be Twist Fate, for example, because it avoids popping the glamour on the first instance. So this is another one that is traditionally popular for elves. You can have a look. There are people who are more expert than I who have put together some really brutal middle-aged Vanheim blesses. For me, the way to go is probably to rainbow out and to plan for the longer game. Because think about it, in the end, what are you going to be using more of? Thugs or sacreds? And to the extent you do use your sacreds, what are the technologies or the things your enemy can do that would normally make those sacreds obsolete, at least as a battlefield weapon? Well, the first thing that let's just go up to a really basic rainbow here for a moment and think about this. Let's try and solve the problems of our units. And because we're rainbow, because we have heaps of early game strength, we can imprison for this thinking. Just for this thinking, we'll go to cold 3 because that's an automatic. This is just a no-brainer. Go cold 3. Let's take growth 3 because we're not a noob. Let's take at least 5 dominion. Probably 6. Let's build 6 so you can produce 1 expansion party a turn, 5 Hell Herdings and a Vanhurst before you've built extra temples. So let's go 6 there. We've got 182 points with 3s in everything. Okay, what can kill our units? Well, fire elementals, magma kids, that sort of stuff would slaughter our units. Fire resistance 10 Doesn't entirely solve the like magma kids and all that problem. It goes a long way though. And thugs are now fire resistant 10, which solves a lot of problems for them. Well, we can do Wrathful Skies. Yeah, we can do Wrathful Skies. So if we give everything shock resistance 10, our army is not going to be annihilated by Wrathful Skies, and we can just throw up Storm, Wrathful Skies, which is on our evocation path anyway, the same thing that's taking us to Wind of Death and Wailing Winds. Just launch us straight towards Wrathful Skies, and our units will mostly shrug it off. Our mages can cast resistance spells to go up to 15 and be truly immune, and most of our units will, well, they won't die. They might take the occasional chip, but they won't die, and they're even less likely to be stunned. Bang! So we've solved that problem. I mean, we've solved all of the evocations other than cold, so we may as well solve cold. Although the option to go defense skill here is also tempting. Depends on whether you think cold evocations are something you want to defend against. Adding 2 more defense takes you to 21. Also helps your thugs. So let's leave that for the moment. Earth. Well, the problem with going fire and shock resistance, I mean, this is an amazing deal, but it's incarnate. One of the problems, I think, can actually be hitting hard enough to kill people. The Hell Hurting only does 15 damage by default. Adding 2 more strength takes it up to 17, which is starting to get more respectable, especially since it's piercing. And your thugs are not going to mind this either, especially if they're using weapons that aren't based on the AoE. So if you're counter-thugging, that extra 2 damage is suddenly very, very welcome. We're in an era where Ubar exists. We're in an era where like Fog Warriors and all that is a problem, and that can make our units obsolete. So we can pick up some magic weapons at this point. We could also forget about the Hell Hurting and instead invest in more magic resistance for our thugs. MR17 is pretty, 16, 17 is pretty good at base. If you really want to, you can go 1 more and pick up minor magic resistance if you want. But for the moment, let's just solve the problem of invisible units ruining our day. Death, well, I want a little bit of undead command because we want to be able to lead around our corpse constructs, although you can cheap out and do that using Hellcals if you want. But this gives a Hellcal 50 undead leadership instead, and then let's make our units just a little bit more survivable by tacking on some Undying. Nature, well, we know the problem here. We don't want people poisoning us. Okay, so we're now immune to foul vapors. So you can go invade any foul vapors nation now with your sacreds, and you're fine. Your mages and your sacreds just don't care. 15 poison resistance is enough to shut down foul vapors. You're done. Cool. Okay, well, our units are super killy. So if we pick up 1 more blood point, bang, we now have Blood Surge, which is also a much better deal for thugs than just going for Blood 3 and picking up the strength. This is all just my opinion. This is me illustrating the idea. So now, this is basically, if you're talking about a thug, we have basically just bought 3 attack, 3 strength, 1 defense, and 1 reinvigoration. And for the Hell Hurtings, this is a really good bless because they have lance charges and really high attack, and we've given them extra strength already. So they're probably going to hit on their first attack. They're probably going to kill something on their first attack, which means it's basically +3 attack, +3 strength, +1 defense, +1 reinvigoration. And that +3 attack on their lance is going to give them the ability to repel. Great. So we've just solved that problem, which I think is pretty cool. We've still got our water left over. Defense skill, cold resistance, pick what you like. You've still got 118 points to play with here, which is probably 2 scales and then a little more magic. So I would probably sloth 1, order 1, because you favor recruitment points over resources. Resources will not be your gate. You can pick up magic 1, luck 1, and then what? Oh, okay, we can't go Dominion 7. We could easily pick up another point here somewhere. Okay, so we can pick up another point in water or fire or air or whatever. So you could go minor cold resistance and defense skill. There you go. That's perfectly serviceable. Perfectly serviceable. If you want to copy any Pangean bless for white centaurs, so the larger blesses on white centaurs, also cool, because your thugs being larger also gives them an advantage. But if you think about what I've just achieved here, I've got a nation with net positive scales. I'm probably going to get my heroes. I'm growing. I've got a little more recruitment points. I can make sacreds every turn. I'm probably going to have the money to make the sacreds every turn. And I've got a little bit of boost to my research. And in exchange, fire elementals probably won't counter me. Air elementals probably won't counter me. Evocations, yeah, no early game. Heck, there are very few evocations in general that will now counter this. High protection, like, sorta, but not really. But also not really. There are very few units that can just protection tank a line of Hell Herdings that have Blood Surge and Strength of the Earth, because the Lance Charge is probably going to get them to the point where they're Blood Surging, and if they're Blood Surging, they're now doing 20 damage per turn at attack skill 16. Very respectable. That's before veterancy stars. Undying makes them less likely to die. Magic weapons counters a whole bunch of opposing crap. The poison resistance takes foul vapors and a whole bunch of poison cheese off the table. And when your god eventually wakes up, you've got access to everything. This is a god that gives you access to, for the late game, elemental mastery, crystals, all the blood cross path stuff. This guy gives you vampire lords without boosting. This guy gives you the big blood summons. Everything. This god at turn 36, which is when you start needing new tricks, like really needing new tricks to close the game out, he's going to come online and solve all your diversity problems if you just need that one spell or that one item. So, for me, Helheim, it's the Imprisoned Rainbow. You can go aggressive and awake. Like, yes, you can roll out the double Incarnate Bless and go all in on the rush. But remember, my experience is mostly playing larger games. This is, I think, one thing that differentiates my advice and shapes me away from other people is I tend to play larger games. And in larger games, endurance matters. You need to make the most out of your territory because the rushing everyone build just gets you dogpiled. Helheim, I think there's a reason to be a little more circumspect. No one's going to want to rush you anyway. It's not like you're an early game weak nation that becomes strong later. You're an early game powerhouse that becomes strong later. The nations that can rush you early are the ones who can come at you with things that are kind of like what you've got. Vanheim, Pangaea, people who can come at you with Sacred Cav or Sacred Double Attack Infantry, things that can deal with your Sacred Cav early on. That's who can come at you. Everyone else should not so much. Everyone else not so much. So those are my general thoughts on Helheim. It's tremendously powerful. It's got this air-death cross path, but it's got a little bit of access to like earth and blood and other things that really shouldn't be ruled out, like blood empowering a Svartalf in order to be able to get bloodstones and all that is pretty trivial. It's a nation with a clear expansion plan, a clear first war plan, options for its like first magic-equipped mid-game war, a solid strategic mobility and stealth, which makes it a frightening diplomatic player. And perhaps that's how I'll close out, on how, if you're Helheim, I think you can maneuver. Because your armies are concealed, enemies never know whether you're concentrating against them or not. This makes them less likely to attack you because they don't know if you're weak. It also makes a nap with you more valuable. One of the gifts you just get given as an elf nation, especially one like Helheim, is that people are more, it's like water nations, people are more likely to want to nap with you than you are with them. You napping with them limits your ability to elf them, which is exactly why they probably want it. So you can get more out of your peace negotiations as Helheim than you could if the situation was more symmetrical. Water nations can demand more in naps because if there is a war, often they're under no threat. Helheim can demand more because as an elf nation, the enemy otherwise never knows if they're under threat and never knows if they face an opportunity. So for me, Helheim, you can exploit the strategic ambiguity. You can use stealth, glamour and mobility to engage in a little bit of strategic and diplomatic adventurism. And as long as you manage to keep your enemy count low, you've probably got the tools necessary to do it. And with strategic ambiguity and concealed armies as your primary friends, you might be able to, if you're properly on the ball, dissuade people from storming into you whenever you turn your back, because no one ever knows which way you are truly facing unless they have scouts and can see all the armies actually fighting. So, overall evaluation for Helheim. Top tier, and anyone who says otherwise can come at me. Death Air is oppressive. Sacred Cavalry are probably the best archetype of sacred unit in the game, and they do very, very well with the most efficient sort of blessed setup, which is the Imprisoned Rainbow in the game. They have late game options, early game options, mid game options, counters to just about all of the gimmicks and tools that are out there, while having access to some of the most brutally oppressive gimmicks and tools themselves, those being the Death Air crosspath, and eventually the opportunities to go into big blood and late game death. This is a powerhouse nation, and if I was given the chance to play Dominions in the early age for my life, and someone told me I drew Helheim, I wouldn't be disappointed. It's up there with those nations. It's like Fomoria. If I drew it, I'd want to practice because it can be complicated, but at the same time, it gives you so much to work with that I think it clearly stands over and above a lot of its competitors. Those are my opinions, thoughts in the comments. Thank you again to my generous patrons for sponsoring these videos. It gives me the confidence to spend a little bit more time familiarizing, practicing, playing, editing, and also producing just longer videos in general, because their generous support makes me want to go just that little bit further. So thank you again, and if you can support me there, I'd very much appreciate it. Any thoughts on Helheim, please share them in the comments. I'm sure I've misspoken in some critical areas, I always do. But I think that's pretty much it. So until next time, all the best. And remember, there might always be an elf in that empty province.